My name is Catherine Ross. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where reliability is valued more than visibility. Corporate rooms with glass walls, calendars that never sleep, and conversations that happen after you leave the room. I've been called steady, low maintenance, someone who doesn't need managing. Those sound like compliments. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're the reason people forget to look up when you're standing right in front of them. If you were to ask my colleagues how they saw me back then, they would probably say I was competent, calm, and not particularly ambitious. Someone who did her job well, didn't make noise, didn't compete for attention. What they didn't see, what I learned not to show, was how closely I listened, how carefully I remembered patterns, and how deeply I believed in fairness even when I didn't demand it out loud. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or delivering dramatic speeches. It's about something quieter, and in many ways, more uncomfortable. What happens when you realize that being underestimated has consequences, and that silence can either erase you or protect you, depending on how you use it? I want to be clear from the beginning. I'm not telling this to stir anger or to paint myself as a hero. I'm telling it because the moment it begins is painfully common. My promotion was announced, publicly, formally, then given to someone else the very same day. The explanation was simple, almost casual. They said it was a last-minute decision. No raised voices, no apology that lasted longer than a sentence, just a recalibration of reality that I was expected to accept gracefully. What follows is not a fast story. It unfolds over months, not minutes. It's about the small cuts that don't bleed right away. The ways we normalize being overlooked because it's easier than questioning the system that benefits from our quiet. It's about how people assign you a role without ever asking if you agree to play it, and what happens when, internally, you decide you won't anymore. There are no dramatic confrontations here, no viral moments, no sudden luck. There is preparation, observation, documentation, and a series of choices made without announcing them. The emotional journey moves from confusion to clarity, from disappointment to a kind of calm resolve. Not the kind that seeks to win, but the kind that refuses to lose itself. If you stay with me through this, you'll hear how silence can be mistaken for weakness, how leverage often hides in plain sight, and how consequences don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they arrive as an absence. Sometimes as a matter of inevitability. I'm sharing this with honesty, not spectacle, because I suspect that if you've ever been reliable enough to be overlooked, patient enough to be dismissed, or calm enough to be underestimated, you may recognize parts of yourself here. Have you ever had a moment where something was taken from you quietly, and you weren't sure whether to speak or to wait? For a long time, I was the person people trusted without thinking about it. Not the kind of trust that comes with admiration or curiosity, but the kind that lets you set something down and walk away, assuming it will still be there when you return. I was dependable in a way that faded into the background. Useful, stable, predictable. In meetings, I was the one who took notes no one asked for, but everyone later requested. I translated vague ideas into timelines, turned ambitious promises into realistic delivery plans, and quietly corrected errors before they became problems. When something went right, it was the team. When something almost went wrong, it was often because I had intervened early enough that no one ever knew there had been a risk at all. People describe me as calm. That was true. But calm is often misunderstood. They assumed it meant I didn't care as deeply, didn't want more, didn't notice when decisions were made without me. In reality, my calm came from discipline. I chose not to react to every slight because I believed consistency would speak for itself over time. My manager used to say I was solid. Not brilliant. Not visionary. Solid. The kind of employee you lean on while you celebrate others. The kind you don't worry about leaving out of the spotlight because she won't complain. And I didn't. Not because I didn't feel the sting, but because I had internalized the idea that good work naturally rises. That patience was a virtue that would be rewarded eventually. I was often asked to support new leaders, especially those younger than me. I trained them, filled in their gaps, and made sure their first months went smoothly. They would thank me sincerely, sometimes even publicly, and then slowly stop including me in the conversations where decisions were actually made. I told myself this was normal, that my role was operational, not strategic, that not everyone needed to be seen to be valuable. When promotions were discussed in abstract terms, my name was never contested. People would nod when it came up. "Catherine's great," someone would say. "Very reliable." The conversation would move on. No one argued against me. No one argued for me either. I existed in that comfortable middle space where competence is acknowledged, but ambition is quietly assumed to be absent. I dressed neutrally. I spoke carefully. I didn't interrupt. I waited for pauses that rarely came. And when they did, I made my point concisely, without embellishment. I thought this was professionalism. I thought clarity would be enough. What I didn't realize was that clarity without insistence often gets filed away and forgotten. Outside of work, people saw me the same way. The friend who listens, the one who remembers birthdays, the one who helps you move without making it a story. I had built a life around being low friction. I believed that not taking up too much space was a form of kindness. But invisibility has a cost. It doesn't arrive as pain at first. It arrives as a subtle erosion. You start to question whether wanting more is greedy, whether disappointment is a failure of gratitude, whether silence is maturity or avoidance. To them, I was safe. I wouldn't make waves. I wouldn't challenge decisions publicly. I wouldn't force anyone to feel uncomfortable. They could rely on me to absorb the unglamorous parts of the work and still show up composed the next day. What they didn't understand was that I was paying attention, that every time my contributions were summarized by someone else, every time my readiness was acknowledged but not acted on, I noticed. I remembered. Not with resentment, but with precision. This is who I was to them, the dependable constant, the background stability. The person whose presence was felt most when something went wrong, and only then. And for a long time, I accepted that role without question. Because I thought that being essential, even quietly, was enough. The first time it happened, it was easy to dismiss. It was during a quarterly planning meeting, the kind that stretched across an entire afternoon and ended with more action items than answers. I had spent weeks preparing for it, mapping dependencies, identifying risks, running scenarios no one had asked for, but everyone would eventually need. I knew the material intimately. I had built it. When the meeting started, my manager introduced the agenda and then, without looking at me, asked a newer colleague to walk the room through the operational plan. It wasn't a mistake. I could tell by the way the slide deck had already been shared under his name. My name was in the document history, quietly, like a footnote. As he spoke, he repeated my language almost verbatim. The same phrasing, the same caution around timelines. At one point, he even paused and glanced in my direction, as if checking whether he had missed something. I gave a small nod. He continued. No one questioned why he was presenting work he hadn't authored. No one acknowledged the shift. It was seamless, efficient. And when the plan was approved, the room moved on. Afterward, my manager pulled me aside and said, "You did a great job supporting that." Supporting. Not leading. Not owning. Supporting. I remember smiling and saying, "Of course." Because that was the correct response. Because calling it out would have seemed petty. Because it was, in theory, a small thing. One meeting. One presentation. But that evening, as I replayed the day in my head, something felt off. Not anger. More like a quiet dissonance. I realized that the story of my work had been told without me in it, and that everyone seemed comfortable with that version. I told myself it was situational. That may have made sense politically. That visibility would come later. I reminded myself that I wasn't someone who needed credit to feel secure, that my value wasn't dependent on recognition. Still, I started to notice changes. Small ones. Emails where my contributions were summarized by someone else. Decisions that referenced my analysis but didn't include me in the discussion. Praise that arrived indirectly, filtered through another voice. Each instance on its own was explainable. None of it was overtly hostile. There were no insults, no raised eyebrows, no dismissive laughter. Just a gradual reallocation of presence. I didn't protest. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't say, actually, that was my work. Because I had been taught, implicitly, that doing so would make me difficult, defensive, emotional. And I had worked too hard to be seen as steady to risk that label. Instead, I adjusted. I worked a little harder, documented a little more thoroughly. I told myself that if I made my contributions undeniable, the system would correct itself. But that first small cut did something important. It marked a line. It showed me how easily authorship could be reassigned, how quickly effort could be reframed as support, and how silence could be interpreted as consent. What stayed with me most wasn't the meeting itself. It was how quickly everyone forgot it had ever been different. Including, at first, me. Once the first boundary is crossed quietly, it becomes easier for the next one to disappear. After that meeting, the pattern didn't announce itself. It settled in. I was still included, still consulted, still looped in early enough to fix problems. But the center of gravity had shifted. My work moved through other people before it reached decision makers. My voice became indirect. At first, I framed it as a collaboration. I told myself this was what mature teams looked like: fluid ownership, shared credit. I didn't want to be territorial. I didn't want to seem insecure about recognition. So when someone paraphrased my insights as their own, I let it pass. When my recommendations were presented without my name attached, I stayed quiet. There was a meeting where a senior leader praised a strategy I had developed, addressing the person who presented it. I was sitting 3 seats away. I remember the moment clearly because I felt something tighten in my chest, not enough to hurt, just enough to register. I smiled anyway. I always smiled. I started to hear phrases like, "This aligns with what Catherine usually handles," or, "We'll have Catherine's sanity check this." My role was being defined in terms of maintenance, not direction. Oversight, not ownership. I was becoming the person who made things safe, not the one who moved them forward. And I let it happen, not because I agreed with it, but because challenging it felt like breaking an unspoken agreement. The agreement said, if you're calm, you'll be protected. If you don't ask for too much, you'll be trusted. If you don't make people uncomfortable, you'll be valued. I told myself that respect didn't need to be visible to be real. That influence could be quiet. That power didn't always look like authority. These ideas weren't entirely wrong, but they were incomplete. And I was using them to justify staying still. What made it harder was that no one was explicitly unkind. People were friendly. They asked for my input. They thanked me. The environment was polite, even warm, which meant that any discomfort I felt seemed unreasonable by comparison. How could I complain when everyone was so nice? So I normalized it. I adjusted my expectations downward without admitting that I was doing it. I stopped imagining myself in leadership roles and told myself I preferred depth over visibility. I stopped preparing for opportunities I no longer believed were meant for me. The disrespect wasn't loud, it was procedural, built into workflows, embedded in who was invited to which meeting, who was CC'd versus addressed directly. It was the absence of assumption, that I would lead, that I would decide, that I would be seen. And because it was normalized, it became invisible. To them. Almost to me. Almost. It took me longer than I like to admit to understand that I had been cast in a role. No one ever sat me down and explained it. There was no memo, no conversation, no moment where I could point and say, "This is when it happened." It revealed itself gradually, through repetition, through expectations that were never questioned. I was the one who would stay late to make sure things didn't fall apart, the one who absorbed last-minute changes without complaint, the one who could be trusted to fix problems quietly so leadership wouldn't have to explain delays or missteps. If something was fragile, it was handed to me. If something was high profile, it went elsewhere. People began to speak to me in a certain tone, reassuring, almost parental. "We know you'll handle this. You're so good at keeping things running. We couldn't do this without you." Statements that sounded like appreciation, but functioned more like containment. They praised my reliability in ways that subtly discouraged me from wanting more. When new initiatives were announced, I was looped in after the direction had already been set. My job was to operationalize, not to question, to refine, not to redefine. And because I was good at that work, the role hardened around me. I remember one conversation in particular. A colleague, well-meaning, senior, candid, said, "You're kind of the backbone of this place." He smiled when he said it, as if offering a compliment. And I thanked him. But later, alone, the word backbone echoed uncomfortably. Backbones don't choose where the body goes. They just support the movement. I realized then that I was being valued for my endurance, not my direction. For my steadiness, not my judgment. The role I had been assigned was the reliable constant, the one who made others look capable by ensuring nothing broke, and I had accepted it because it aligned with how I saw myself. Responsible, measured, useful. I told myself that leadership didn't need to be loud, that influence could be exerted from the margins. But the truth was simpler and harder. I had been placed where I wouldn't disrupt anyone else's trajectory. What made this role particularly effective was that it came with moral praise. Being dependable was framed as virtuous. Wanting recognition was framed as ego. Ambition, especially expressed quietly, was treated as something slightly suspect. So I stayed in my lane. I did excellent work. I protected the system that was slowly teaching me I didn't belong at the center of it. By the time the promotion cycle came around, the narrative was already written. I was essential, but not promotable. Trusted, but not considered. Too valuable for me to be moved. And the most difficult part wasn't that others believed this. It was that, for a while, so did I. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no confrontation, no announcement, no moment where I decided to change everything. In fact, if you had watched me that day, you would have seen the same version of me you always did. Composed, prepared, attentive. I went to meetings. I answered emails. I solved problems. But internally, a quiet line moved. It happened in a conference room just before lunch. The promotion had been announced that morning. My name read aloud. A brief pause, polite applause. I remember the way my manager smiled at me, as if to say, "Finally." And for a few hours, I allowed myself to believe it. Not celebrate, just believe. Then, shortly before noon, I was asked to step into a smaller room. The explanation came carefully, rehearsed. There had been a last-minute decision. Leadership felt someone else was a better fit right now. They emphasized how valued I was, how much they still wanted me exactly where I was. They said it wasn't a reflection of my performance. I listened without interrupting. I nodded at the appropriate moments. I asked one clarifying question. Not why, but what changes. The answer was vague. Nothing, really. Except the title. Except for the future. When the conversation ended, I thanked them for their transparency. That part still surprises people when I tell this story. They expect anger or tears, or at least visible shock. But what I felt was something else. Not devastation. Not even disbelief. It was clarity. As I walked back to my desk, I realized that the decision itself wasn't the turning point. The turning point was how easy it had been for them to reverse it. how quickly my advancement had been treated as adjustable, optional, reversible. How little discomfort the change seemed to cause. I sat down and opened my notebook, the one I carried everywhere but rarely used for anything personal. And for the first time, I didn't write action items or follow-ups. I wrote a sentence. I see the pattern now. That was all. The shift wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about plotting or planning. It was the moment I stopped assuming the system would correct itself if I just waited long enough. I understood then that silence had not been neutral. It had been instructive. I finished the day the same way I always did. Calm, professional, helpful. But something fundamental had changed. I was no longer waiting to be seen. I was watching. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been automatic, an instinct shaped by habit and reward. Now it was deliberate. I still spoke when necessary, still offered insight when asked, but I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped volunteering clarity into rooms that hadn't invited me to shape the outcome. No one noticed at first. That was the irony. They were used to my presence being frictionless, my contributions appearing without effort. So when I became more contained, it registered as normal, as maturity, as a focus. People mistook my restraint for acceptance. I continued to deliver exactly what my role required. Nothing less, nothing extra. I met deadlines. I documented processes. I answered direct questions precisely and briefly. But I no longer preempted mistakes that leadership was determined to make. I no longer translated confusion into coherence unless it was explicitly my responsibility. This wasn't passive aggression. It was alignment. I was matching my output to my actual authority. In meetings, I listened more than I spoke. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was learning. I was watching who deferred to whom, whose ideas were repeated, whose silence was interpreted as consent. I noticed how often decisions were framed as collaborative after they were already made. The interesting thing about strategic silence is that people project onto it. Some assumed I was disengaged. Others assumed I was content. A few assumed I was simply tired. No one assumed I was preparing. And preparation, I learned, doesn't require announcement. I kept my notebook close. Not to record grievances, but to document facts. Dates, dependencies, who owned what in theory versus in practice, where information flowed, and where it bottlenecked. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was building a map. There was a calmness in this phase that surprised me. Without the constant effort of proving my worth, I had more energy to observe. Without the hope of recognition, disappointment lost its edge. I wasn't withdrawing. I was repositioning. When people praised my grace after the promotion reversal, I accepted the compliment without correcting them. Grace, after all, can look a lot like patience. And patience, when misunderstood, creates space. They thought my silence meant I had agreed to stay where I was. They didn't realize it had become a choice. What they never noticed was how much of the system ran through me. Not because I was important in a dramatic way, but because over the years, I had become a quiet intersection. Processes passed through my inbox. Decisions were based on my documentation. External partners trusted my follow-through more than any org chart. I had been careful, consistent, and precise, and that had created a kind of structural familiarity no one had bothered to name. While they assumed I was simply doing my job, I was learning exactly how my job fit into the larger machine. I knew which reports were built on assumptions I had validated, which timelines only worked because I had negotiated flexibility behind the scenes, which strategic initiatives depended on operational shortcuts that lived in my head and my files. None of this was secret. It was just unexamined. I began to formalize what had previously been informal. I documented workflows in neutral language. I clarified ownership in shared documents. I archived email threads that showed how decisions were actually made, not how they were later described. This wasn't about leverage in the dramatic sense. It was about accuracy. I also started to notice how often my judgment was used without attribution. How often leaders leaned on my risk assessments while presenting confidence as their own. I didn't correct them. I noted it. At the same time, I invested quietly in myself. I refreshed certifications that no one had asked for. I reconnected with contacts outside the company, not to complain, just to reestablish professional presence. I listened more than I spoke in those conversations, too. What made this phase invisible was that nothing outward changed. I still showed up on time. I still met expectations. I still appeared, to anyone watching casually, exactly as I always had. But internally, I was no longer operating on hope. I was operating on information. I understood then that power isn't always about authority. Sometimes it's about being the person who knows how things actually work when the slides stop making sense. And I had been that person for years without realizing the implications. They never noticed because they had never needed to. The system worked. Until it wouldn't. And when it didn't, they would finally see what had been holding it together. Just not in the way they expected. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where everything suddenly clicked into place with a sense of triumph. It arrived slowly, through accumulation, until one evening I sat at my kitchen table and realized I was no longer confused. I was clear. I spread my notebook open beside my laptop and traced the threads I had been following for months. Process ownership that existed only in practice, not on paper. Vendor relationships that defaulted to me, regardless of who officially led the initiative. Risk approvals that relied on my sign-off, even when my role didn't explicitly require it. What I saw wasn't a weakness in the company. It was a dependency. One that had grown quietly because I had been reliable enough to make it invisible. The private reveal was understanding that my value wasn't abstract. It was operationally specific. If I stepped back, not emotionally, but structurally, certain things would slow. Questions would surface. Decisions would suddenly require clarification that no one else had bothered to learn. This wasn't a fantasy. It was an observable reality. I didn't feel excitement. I felt something closer to relief. For the first time since the promotion reversal, I wasn't asking whether I had been wrong about my worth. I was asking what responsibility I had to myself now that I understood it. I also saw something else, equally important. The system wasn't malicious. It was efficient. It placed people where they caused the least disruption. I had been too good at absorbing complexity, too quiet about my ambition. The machine had done what machines do. That clarity removed the last of my anger. I didn't want to punish anyone. I didn't want recognition retroactively. I wanted alignment between what I gave and what I received, between my role and my reality. An alignment, I realized, would require change, not demanded, executed. I closed the notebook that night without writing a conclusion. I didn't need one. The path forward didn't require emotion. It required a decision, and I was ready to make it. There is a moment, quiet, unmarked, when understanding turns into responsibility. Clarity, on its own, is passive. You can see the truth and still choose comfort. Still choose familiarity. Still choose to stay where the ground is uneven, but known. For weeks after my private reveal, I existed in that in-between state. I understood the system. I understood my place in it. And I understood, finally, that nothing was going to change unless I moved first. The decision point didn't arrive with urgency. It arrived as a question I could no longer avoid. If nothing changes, can I live with the person I will become by staying? That question followed me everywhere. Not loudly. It didn't interrupt meetings or keep me awake at night. It surfaced in small, inconvenient moments, while approving a process I had designed but no longer owned. While watching someone else receive credit for stability they didn't understand. While hearing my name used as shorthand for reliability rather than leadership. I realized something unsettling. I wasn't angry anymore, but I was starting to disappear. Not from the company, from myself. I had spent years shaping my identity around being reasonable, adaptable, and patient. Those qualities had served me well. They had kept me respected, trusted, but they had also kept me contained. And containment, over time, becomes a form of erosion. So I began to examine my options with the same discipline I applied to my work. Option 1 was the most obvious. I could confront the situation directly, request a meeting, lay out my contributions, ask why the promotion had been reversed, advocate for myself explicitly. Many people would say this was the mature path, but when I imagined it honestly, I saw the outcome clearly. In the best case, I would receive reassurance, promises, a revised timeline. Worst case, I would be labeled difficult, emotional, suddenly ambitious in a way that disrupted the narrative they were comfortable with. Either way, I would still be operating within a system that had already shown me how easily it could reframe me. Confrontation would create conversation, not change. Option 2 was to wait, to continue performing flawlessly, and hope that eventually, someone would notice the imbalance and correct it. This was the option I had lived inside for years without naming it. But waiting required faith. Faith that the same structure that benefited from my silence would one day reward it. Faith that fairness would emerge organically from convenience. And I no longer believed that. Option 3 was to leave, cleanly, quietly. Take my experience elsewhere, and let the company feel the absence in hindsight. This option tempted me more than I expected. There was dignity in it, finality, but it also felt incomplete. Leaving without recalibrating the narrative meant carrying the same pattern forward. Different environment, same role, new faces. I didn't want escape, I wanted integrity. The final option, the one I resisted longest, was to change my relationship to the system without announcing it. To stop performing the version of myself that had made invisibility easy. To align my actions not with expectation, but with authority. This option required restraint, precision. It required me to act without needing validation. And most importantly, it required me to accept that once I started, there would be no applause, no reassurance, no turning back. That was the irreversible part. I spent several evenings thinking through consequences. Not emotional ones, but practical ones. What would happen if I stopped being the silent failsafe? If I allowed ownership gaps to surface naturally? If I honored the limits of my role instead of compensating for them? The answers were uncomfortable, but not catastrophic. Delays would occur. Questions would escalate. Decisions would slow. Not because I caused problems, but because I would no longer prevent them preemptively. I realized then how much of my labor had been anticipatory. I had been solving problems before anyone else even knew they existed. And in doing so, I had removed the feedback loop that would have revealed how much I depended on myself. The decision wasn't to sabotage. That would violate my moral code. The decision was to stop cushioning the system from its own design choices. I also thought about my reputation, the quiet one. The stable one. The one who never made things difficult. I knew that reputation would change. Not because I would become disruptive, but because I would become precise. Precision makes people uneasy. When you stop absorbing ambiguity for others, they are forced to confront it themselves. And people often mistake that discomfort for conflict. I asked myself whether I was prepared for that. Whether I could remain calm while being misunderstood. Whether I could hold my ground without constantly defending myself. The answer surprised me. Yes, because I had already been misunderstood for years. I had simply benefited from the misunderstanding. Now I would outgrow it. The final piece of the decision point wasn't about the company at all. It was about who I wanted to be going forward. I didn't want to be admired for my endurance. I didn't want to be essential but interchangeable. I didn't want to keep confusing being needed with being valued. I wanted my work and my position to tell the same story. So I made the decision quietly, without ceremony. I would stop overfunctioning. I would stop lending authority where none had been granted. I would document, clarify, and deliver exactly to scope. And I would let reality do the rest. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a strategy designed to force recognition. It was an internal alignment, a withdrawal of excess labor, a refusal to continue subsidizing a system that had already shown me where it placed me. Once I made that decision, something unexpected happened. I felt calm, not relieved, not vindicated, just steady, because I understood that from this point forward, whatever happened would be honest. If the system adjusted, it would be because it had to. If it didn't, I would have my answer without needing to ask the question again. This was the moment the story stopped being about what they did to me and became about what I chose not to do anymore. And that choice, once made, could not be reversed. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the urge to act quickly. That was the first sign that it was real. In the past, any internal shift I'd experienced had come with restlessness, an urge to do something, to fix, to explain, to accelerate resolution. This time, there was none of that. The decision didn't create momentum. It created steadiness, a sense that the next steps didn't need force, only consistency. So I moved slowly, precisely, almost invisibly. I didn't announce boundaries, I honored them. The first changes were so small they were nearly untraceable. A request arrived late on a Friday afternoon, loosely worded, with an implied expectation that I would just handle it. Before, I would have. I would have worked through the weekend, not because anyone demanded it, but because the problem existed, and I was capable of solving it. This time I replied with 3 sentences: clear, neutral, professional. I asked who owned the final decision. I asked what deadline had been communicated externally. I asked whether this task had been formally prioritized against my current commitments. No defensiveness, no refusal, just questions. The response didn't come until Monday. That alone told me something had shifted. Another time, a meeting was scheduled to pressure test a plan that had already been approved. Historically, this meant I would surface risks quietly, adjust timelines diplomatically, and ensure the plan survived contact with reality. This time, I listened. When asked directly, I answered honestly, but narrowly. I didn't extrapolate. I didn't rescue. I didn't soften. The room felt slightly less confident afterward. No one blamed me. They simply felt for the first time the weight of their own assumptions. I began to notice how often my labor had functioned as insulation. I had protected people from the consequences of vague thinking, rushed decisions, and unclear ownership. And in doing so, I had trained them not to notice the insulation existed. Removing it didn't cause immediate damage. It caused awareness. Emails took longer. Clarifications increased. People circled back on decisions they had previously rushed through. There were more follow-ups, more alignment meetings, more requests for confirmation. All of it was reasonable. All of it had always been necessary. I also became more exact with language. Where I had once said, "I'll take care of it," I now said, "I can support once ownership is confirmed." Where I had once said, "This should work," I now said, "This works if these conditions hold." Subtle shifts, but language shapes expectation, and expectation shapes behavior. One of the hardest habits to break was anticipatory compliance, the instinct to act before being asked, to solve problems before they surfaced. That instinct had been praised for years. It had made me invaluable. It had also made me invisible. So when I saw a potential issue developing outside my scope, I documented it and shared it with the appropriate owner instead of intervening directly. If they acted, the issue would be resolved. If they didn't, the issue became visible. Either outcome was honest. There were moments of discomfort. Times when I knew I could fix something in minutes that would otherwise take days. Times when I felt the familiar pull of responsibility tug at me, not because it was mine, but because it was easy. Those were the moments I paused. I reminded myself that ease is not the same as alignment. If the system depended on my constant overextension to function smoothly, then the system wasn't functioning. It was borrowing stability, and I had stopped lending it without acknowledgement. Externally, I adjusted with the same care. Partners who had come to rely on my responsiveness began to experience a more formal process. I didn't disappear. I didn't disengage. I redirected. consistently. Some adapted quickly. Others expressed mild confusion. No one expressed anger. Confusion is quieter than conflict, but it's more revealing. Internally, I noticed something else. My calendar changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Fewer emergency meetings, fewer last-minute requests, more clearly scoped conversations. It wasn't because people needed me less. It was because they had to think more before involving me. That alone shifted the dynamic. I also stopped narrating my intentions. I didn't explain that I was focusing on scope. I didn't say I was realigning priorities. I didn't frame my actions as self-care or strategy. I simply did the work as defined. People tend to argue with explanations. They have a harder time arguing with consistency. Weeks passed, then months. The machine continued to run. But the quiet efficiencies I had once provided without recognition were no longer automatic. Small inefficiencies appeared, not failures, but friction. The kind that prompts questions. Why does this take longer now? Who owns this decision? Why wasn't this caught earlier? The answers were always there. They just weren't comfortable. Still, no one connected the dots. No one said my name in relation to the change. They assumed complexity had increased. Those priorities had shifted. That growth had consequences. They weren't wrong. What they didn't realize was that the growth they were feeling wasn't new. It had always existed. I had simply stopped absorbing it on their behalf. There was a particular afternoon when I realized just how invisible this phase was. A senior leader commented in a meeting that things felt a bit less streamlined lately. He said it casually, without accusation. Others nodded. Someone suggested a process review. I sat quietly and took notes. Not because I felt responsible, but because I wasn't. That was the difference. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing exactly what aligns with your role, and nothing that erases you beyond it. I hadn't withdrawn effort. I had withdrawn excess. And excess, I learned, is often what systems rely on most. The longer this continued, the clearer something became to me. Even if nothing else happened, even if no one ever acknowledged the shift, I had already reclaimed something essential. My labor was finally proportional to my authority. My calm was no longer compliance. My silence was no longer erasure. It was structured, and structure, once changed, alters everything that depends on it, whether anyone notices right away or not. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They arrived as a feeling, a subtle sense, shared but unnamed, that things were taking longer than they used to. Those decisions required more follow-up. Those projects felt heavier, not because they were more complex, but because fewer things were being quietly absorbed before reaching the surface. At first, the discomfort was attributed to growth. The company was expanding. New hires were onboarding. Priorities were shifting. These explanations were convenient, and they allowed everyone to move on without asking deeper questions. Including me, I continued to operate within my defined scope. Calm, consistent, exact. And because I wasn't refusing work, because I wasn't disengaged or emotional, there was nothing obvious to confront. The system didn't feel attacked. It felt exposed. Small things began to slip. A vendor followed up twice on a decision that had previously been handled in a single exchange. A deadline was pushed, not missed, just adjusted, because someone realized late that approval hadn't actually been secured. A meeting ended without resolution because no one in the room could confidently say who owned the final call. None of these moments was dramatic, but they accumulated. What changed most noticeably was the tone of conversations. Where there had once been certainty, there was now qualification. Where there had once been speed, there was now caution. People began to say things like, "We should probably double-check this," or "Let's make sure we're aligned before moving forward." Alignment, I noticed, was often code for "we're not sure anymore." In the past, I had provided that certainty without being asked. I had filled in gaps intuitively, smoothing transitions before they became visible. Now, those gaps remained visible long enough to be acknowledged. Still, no one blamed me. That's an important detail. When systems rely on invisible labor, they rarely recognize its absence as intentional. They interpret it as a change in environment, not a change in behavior. And so the early consequences were diffuse. No single person felt responsible. No single decision could be traced back to a missing piece. Instead, there was a general sense of friction. I began to notice colleagues pausing mid-sentence in meetings, as if expecting someone to complete the thought. They didn't look at me directly, but there was a moment of searching, a hesitation. Then they would continue, less confidently. Emails grew longer. More people were CC'd. Questions were asked that had previously been assumed away. This wasn't a failure. It was feedback. And feedback, when it finally surfaces, is rarely welcomed. One afternoon, a project lead stopped by my desk, casually, smiling, and asked if everything was okay. She phrased it gently, as concern rather than accusation. I assured her it was. Because it was. What she meant, I realized, was, why doesn't this feel as easy as it used to? I didn't offer an explanation. Explanations would have centered me as the variable. And I wasn't interested in that. The point wasn't to be noticed. The point was to stop compensating. As weeks passed, the consequences became more tangible. A process review was scheduled. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because things felt less efficient. Leadership wanted to understand where delays were coming from, where handoffs were breaking down. I attended the review as a participant, not a driver. That alone changed the room. People spoke in hypotheticals. They referenced workflows abstractly. They used phrases like usually and I think. When questions arose about why certain steps existed or who had designed them, there were pauses. I answered when asked, factually, without embellishment. I clarified what I owned and what I didn't. Each clarification narrowed the field. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that several assumptions had been built on informal practices that had relied heavily on my discretion and availability. No one said my name out loud, but it hovered in the space between sentences. Afterward, I overheard two colleagues in the hallway. One said, "Things just feel more complicated lately." The other replied, "Yeah, I don't know why." Oh, I did. But knowing doesn't obligate explanation. The most interesting consequence wasn't operational. It was emotional. People became more cautious around me. Not distant, just attentive. They phrased requests more carefully. They confirmed expectations instead of assuming them. Some even asked, "Is this something you can take on? Or should it go elsewhere?" That question had never been asked before. It was a small thing, but it mattered. For years, my availability had been assumed. Now, my consent was required. And that subtle shift redistributed responsibility in ways no policy ever could. There was also a quiet grief in this phase, not mine, but theirs. I saw it in the way certain leaders hesitated before making decisions, in the way some colleagues looked momentarily uncertain when outcomes weren't as smooth. They weren't angry. They weren't resentful. They were adjusting. Adjustment is uncomfortable when you've benefited from something without realizing it existed. At one point, a senior manager commented in a leadership sync that operations felt less intuitive lately. He said it with a frown, not accusatory, just puzzled. Others nodded. Someone suggested more documentation. I almost smiled. Documentation had never been the issue. Interpretation had. Still, I said nothing. Because the consequences that matter most are the ones people arrive at themselves. By this point, the loss was no longer abstract. It was measurable. In time, in confidence, in certainty. Not catastrophic, but undeniable. And still, no one came to me with anger. That was the final confirmation I needed. I hadn't broken trust. I had simply stopped replacing structure with sacrifice. The system was now experiencing the true cost of its design. And costs, once felt, tend to demand answers. Just not immediately. Not yet. By the time anyone tried to fix it, the shape of the problem had already changed. What began as mild friction slowly sharpened into urgency. Not panic, at least not yet, but a noticeable shift in tone. Meetings that once ended with confidence now ended with follow-ups. Timelines that had felt optimistic were suddenly described as aggressive. Leadership started asking not just what was happening, but why it felt harder than it used to. The first attempts to fix things were procedural. More checklists, more standing meetings, more layers of review. None of it addressed the underlying issue, because the underlying issue wasn't the process. It was dependency. They were trying to restore smoothness without understanding what had created it. I watched this unfold with a strange mix of detachment and recognition. Detachment, because I was no longer carrying the weight of correction. Recognition, because I could see exactly where the strain was coming from. I had lived inside it for years. At some point, someone noticed the pattern. Not directly. No one said that Catherine used to handle this. But questions began to circle closer to my work. My name came up more often in conversations about stability, continuity, how things used to run. There were quite a few attempts to re-engage me in the old way. A senior leader asked if I could just take a quick look at something outside my scope. A project manager suggested I sit in on a meeting for context, even though the decisions had already been made. These were framed as requests, not expectations, but the familiarity was there. I declined gently. Or I redirected. Or I asked who owned the next step. Every time, the moment passed without confrontation. But each time, the option to quietly revert slipped further away. What they were really trying to fix wasn't the workflow. It was the absence of an unspoken buffer. The absence of someone who would absorb complexity without needing authority. And that absence couldn't be patched retroactively. The realization came slowly for them. But when it did, it was unsettling. Because it meant acknowledging that the system had relied on something unofficial, something personal, something that could not be mandated. You can't write a policy that replaces unrecognized care. You can't schedule what was previously volunteered. By the time leadership began discussing role clarity and responsibility in earnest, the conditions had shifted. I was no longer positioned as the quiet constant. I had become, unintentionally, a variable. And variables make people nervous. There was a meeting, closed, senior, serious, where someone asked whether certain responsibilities should be formally reassigned, whether the capacity had changed, whether expectations had drifted. I wasn't in that meeting. That mattered too. They were trying to solve the problem without engaging the source, not out of malice, but because the source had never been named. Fixing it now would require admitting something uncomfortable. That fairness had been deferred, that labor had been unevenly distributed, and that a correction would require more than appreciation. It would require a change. And change, especially late change, threatens existing hierarchies. So the fixes stayed cautious, incremental, safe. Too safe. By the time anyone was ready to ask the real questions, the opportunity for easy repair had passed. Not because I had closed the door, but because the system had already revealed itself to me. And once you see clearly, you can't unsee. They weren't wrong to try to fix it. They were just late. And lateness, in systems built on quiet endurance, carries a cost that can't always be reimbursed. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly calm. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no moment where anyone confessed to wrongdoing. It arrived as a calendar invite with a neutral subject line and a list of attendees that suggested seriousness without urgency. I accepted it without hesitation. The room was familiar. The tone was careful. Leadership thanked me for my time, for my contributions, for my consistency. They spoke about evolving needs and organizational clarity. They asked how I was feeling about my role. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I said I was clear on my responsibilities, that I was comfortable delivering within scope. That clarity had been helpful. There was a pause after that. Not awkward, just telling. They asked whether I felt underutilized. I said I felt accurately utilized. That answer landed harder than I expected, because it reframed the conversation. It removed emotion. It removed the grievance. It left only alignment. Someone asked whether I had noticed changes in how work was flowing. I said I had noticed increased attention to ownership and process, and that I thought it was healthy. No accusations, no defensiveness, just observation. They asked, carefully, whether I would be open to taking on more again, at least temporarily, to stabilize things. That was the moment. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was revealing. The request wasn't framed as a promotion, or a correction, or a rebalancing. It was framed as a favor, a return to the familiar. I declined politely. I said I was focused on maintaining sustainable boundaries, that stepping beyond them again wouldn't be responsible for the team. No one argued. They nodded. They took notes. They thanked me for my honesty. The meeting ended without resolution, and that was the resolution. Confrontation doesn't always end with agreement. Sometimes it ends with recognition. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. I walked out of that room with no sense of victory. Just confirmation. I am not who I was when this story began. Not because something dramatic changed, but because something fundamental aligned. I still work with the same calm. I still value precision, follow-through, and restraint. But those qualities no longer come at the cost of my own clarity. I no longer confuse being agreeable with being ethical, or being needed with being respected. Where I once measured my worth by how much friction I could absorb, I now measure it by how accurately my role reflects my contribution. If something requires my judgment, it requires my authority. If it doesn't, I don't carry it. This has made my life quieter in some ways, and louder in others. Quieter, because I no longer carry unspoken resentment or second-guess my instincts. Louder, because when I do speak, it lands. Not because I demand attention, but because I don't dilute it. People interact with me differently now. Some are more cautious, some are more direct. A few are still adjusting. But the dynamic has changed. I am no longer assumed. I am consulted. I don't regret the years I spent being reliable. They taught me discipline. They taught me systems. They taught me the cost of silence, and the power of it when chosen. What I regret, if anything, is believing that fairness would arrive on its own timetable. Fairness, I've learned, isn't passive. It responds to structure. I didn't need to become louder to be seen. I needed to become clearer. And clarity, once established, tends to reorganize everything around it. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a moral that feels sharp or satisfying. Something that proves a point. Something that rewards patience with triumph, or punishes blindness with regret. But the truth is quieter than that. No one in this story was ruined. No one was publicly exposed. No dramatic justice was delivered. What changed wasn't the people, it was the structure. And structure, once adjusted, changes outcomes without needing villains. For a long time, I believed that being calm meant being good. If I stayed reasonable, fair outcomes would eventually find me. I believed that silence was maturity, that endurance was strength, and that wanting alignment was selfish. What I learned instead is that systems don't correct themselves out of gratitude. They correct themselves when the cost of imbalance becomes visible. I didn't win by outmaneuvering anyone. I didn't even win in the traditional sense. I simply stopped paying a price I had never agreed to. I stopped offering labor that erased me. I stopped confusing kindness with compliance. The most important shift wasn't external. It was internal. I no longer needed to be seen to know my value. And paradoxically, that's what made everything else rearrange itself. If there's a lesson here, it's not to speak louder or fight harder. It's worth noticing where your effort is quietly subsidizing a system that doesn't fully acknowledge it. To ask whether your silence is chosen or assumed. Because when silence is assumed, it becomes a resource others will use without realizing it has limits. And when you reclaim it, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with clarity, the world doesn't collapse. It recalibrates. I'm sharing this story not as instruction, but as reflection. Because many of us live inside roles we never consciously accepted. We perform them well. We perfect them. And one day, we wake up realizing they no longer fit. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to know. Have you ever realized that your silence was holding more together than anyone understood? And what happened when you stopped carrying it alone?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.